I'm Richard Armstrong. I'm Casey's colleague, and you might think of the transition we're about to make as like this. She's thinking about the Homeric poems kind of as an omega text that is the textual residue of centuries of oral performance, oral tradition, and how we can sort of look through that, last text back for centuries. I actually, as my interest in translation is to see it more as an alpha text, which is how once the text is sort of, kind of fixed in a way and people begin to think of it as a book that is authored by a traditional author, which for many centuries is how it was thought of, then it becomes very central, right, to understanding something of the Western literary tradition as a sort of first text, right, the Iliad and the Odyssey as foundational. So what I want to do is talk about the transition into print and to highlight some of the things that we have here and what print technology does to sort of change the whole sort of horizon on ancient texts. Here's a first fact, just to give you an idea about translation. Since the year 2000, there have been over 33 translations of the Iliad and Odyssey into English alone. In other words, the translation of Homer is something that is a marvelous tradition, but it's ongoing. So one thing to think about then is how modernity produces antiquity in a way through translation and study of texts, right? Which is, antiquity's long gone. You can't order things from Amazon from it. But we are continuously sort of producing this relationship through translation in particular. More people are reading Homer now than probably ever in history, but most people read it in translation, okay? So, two key events, 1453, the fall of Constantinople. This is the end of the Byzantine Greek Empire, or effectively the end of the Roman Empire in the East, when it's taken by the Ottoman Turks. The next year, 1454 and 55, we get the production of the first full edition of a book with movable type, which is the introducing of printing. The Gutenberg Bible, I'm sure you might have heard of it, okay? These two events go together very significantly because what this means is a lot of Greek scholars and their manuscripts move from the east to the west precisely because of the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople, at a time when textuality is changing from the whole medieval world of manuscripts, which it's a wonderful world of a very kind of complex type with beautiful illustrations, illuminations. It kind of helps shape the idea of the book in the age of printing in many ways. But fundamentally, this is a major change in human epistemology. The age of printing will change many things. First and foremost, think about visual information. Imagine trying to copy a very complex anatomical diagram by hand and doing that 100 times. And you can understand that in the age of printing, when you can suddenly create visual illustrations, and once you've etched them a certain way, you can print them multiple times, right? You can understand what an absolutely, magnificent shift this is. So, I want to think then about how each stage of material transformation, or sometimes it's called transformation of a text, changes the nature of the text. First and foremost, something weird happens for the first time in Greek tradition, which is gradually Greek texts are being reproduced by non-Greeks. That is to say, this is originally a German technology that the Italians master and sort of spread around, and the French and the English join in. And suddenly, all of the Greek texts that are being produced that are so central to the Renaissance and creating our idea of Western literature is mediated by non-Greeks, which effectively means the knowledge of ancient Greek and the sort of control of this cultural capital shifts to non-Greeks, which is a weird situation we live still to this day when we think about classical studies. There's a sort of technological alienation from a long millennia tradition of Greeks being the ones to do it all to suddenly it is a sort of common possession of people in the West, okay? As more books are printed, though, one of the problems is the manuscripts, like the ones that she showed you that were used to create those texts, are often just put back in libraries and forgotten, or they become invisible, or sadly, sometimes thrown away. And so part of the problem that we have is when the printed book becomes the very way we think of what we might call the ancient archive, right? there is a lot of material that kind of went before that is really essential to look at to understand more how it is that people were reading and using text, all the way back to the papyri that my colleague talked about. So one of the wonderful things about Casey's project in visualizing these pre-print manuscripts is to allow us to really see what it looked like, how this knowledge was mediated. Because if we're not careful, what we're looking at is really an early modern construction of the classical world, or of the classical text. Okay? And that is such a dominant paradigm that even people in classics have a hard time unthinking that. For example, the Iliad is made up of 24 books, that is chapters, right? If you went to the library in Alexandria and said, I would like the whole of the Iliad, they would have given you a bucket of 24 scrolls. So even things like that can be very helpful to realize. We take a lot for granted, right? So print introduces a whole bunch of new textual regimes, we might say. First of all, Greek handwriting is replaced by type fonts. And that to this day, a lot of people in classics who can read printed text very well struggle to read the things that Casey's so good at reading, and in reading Greek paleography, right? Even going back to the ancient stuff. So that's really interesting to see just the very face of the language itself changes, right? We get standardized paging, line numbering. So now if I say, line 107 from Iliad 12, Casey or people around the world will have some idea what that means, right? We also get a whole bunch of texts, or paratext, indices, commentaries, dictionaries. All of this is produced in the early modern era, right? In vast quantities so that non-Greeks, again, can learn Greek and get access to the text. One of the things that you'll be able to see here is increasingly, these are equipped with facing Latin translations. So people are learning Greek through Latin, and this strongly conditions their command of the language in many ways. And that will persist well into the 19th century, okay? And finally, as my colleague Francesca will talk about, we have more vernacular translations happening, often through the mediation of the Latin, or sometimes just from the Latin instead of from the Greek, right? So what you see is we have this sort of complicated situation created by this new archive of antiquity that printing produces. So we happen to have some really wonderful evidence of the first Latin translation here, made by a guy named Leoncio Pilato, and this is Boccaccio and Petrarch, the great humanists, put him up to this. You can see their handwriting in the corner, and you can see him literally going across the top of the Greek text, word for word. And this rather inelegant translation then becomes the basis of a Latin translation that will then put in subsequent editions, and it's revised, etc. But it's a remarkably long-standing crib, or crutch, if you will, that helps people get access to a Greek text that is written in a difficult, poetic language that was no one's native language. So here's a good example of a bilingual text. One of the other things about printing is the creation of whole new formats that in the manuscript world were much harder to produce. So here you see a bilingual in what's called sextodecimo, a very small format. And there on the right, you can see the Greek text in tiny little Greek font, and then the Latin-facing translation. What I have back here in this case, thanks to our librarian friends, is such an example. It's called the Wettstein Homer. This was the Homer to have if you were basically an educated gentleman in the 18th century, because, well into the 19th century, actually. It was a miracle of printing to get all of Homer in Latin and Greek like that in facing translation so that you could carry it around, because gradually Homer is thought of as this poet of nature, the naive poet, and so you must go out to the woods to read your Homer, right? I mean, this is literally, if you read Goethe's book, The Sorrows of Young Werther, this is an arch sort of pre-romantic guy. He's excited in the story when he gets his Wettstein Homer and can go wandering off and doesn't have to bring his big school edition anymore. So this is the actual Wettstein Homer owned by Alexander Pope. I'm going to talk about him for the rest of this talk, in which he sketched the view of Twickenham Church from his garden. And in it, he cites the date, 1719-20, when he completed his translation of the Odyssey. Why is this interesting? Well, Alexander Pope is probably the first person to effectively get rich from translating Homer. He was, if you translate monetarily to modern terms, made a millionaire by a translation of Homer, which is a phenomenal thing in the history of publishing, first of all, because it's very hard to this day to make any kind of money in publishing, much less in translation. This is from a French 19th century author, Chateaubriand. He had also his Wettstein Homer, and notice what he did. He took this to war with him, actually, but he put blank paper in between the Latin and Greek of his text so that he could write his own French translation as something to do in the off hours. So to understand the success of Pope and the wonderful edition we have, I just want to talk a little bit about how modern publishing sort of evolves into modes of publication and distribution. In the Middle Ages and in the early modern period when printing first starts, we have what we might call traditional patronage, right? Where an author or translator gets the help of some powerful person who basically will fund the enterprise. That is, give them something to live on, sometimes by giving them an office, a sinecure of some kind, and then helping to pay for the cost of printing, right? The problem with that, of course, is not that many nobles are all that interested. And one of the first translators of Homer, George Chapman, very famously could not secure a safe patron, right? So it's a very vulnerable thing. Well, the thing that made Alexander Pope and other people like John Dryden more successful is this idea of subscription patronage. So this is an idea of you start to build your audience by selling subscriptions in advance to the book that you are proposing to write. They get a prospectus, and then that is how you start to fund this project of publication. And as we'll talk about very shortly, Alexander Pope did this so successfully that he managed to make way more money than his publisher. So if you're a business student, you should really attend to this. And of course, now we have a paradigm that we often think of publisher patronage, where the publisher will take the full risk, and hope that you'll all make money together. But if you ever shopped a novel around, you might know it's very hard for them to actually feel secure about an awful lot of the writing out there to make money, right? Now, all of these still exist to this day, so don't think of it as historical stages, rather as different modalities. So what happened with Alexander Pope was, in 1714, he publishes a mock epic poem that was in a lovely illustrated edition called The Rape of the Lock, and it sells 3,000 copies in 4 days. That was a big deal back then. It would still be a good deal now, at least for academics. But keep this in mind, right, that he was a known quantity, and his publisher was eager to start a project that would take away some of the cachet that his rival, Jacob Tonsend, who was Dryden's publisher, had at the time. So he asked Pope to translate Homer. Pope only said yes to make money. He had initially no interest in the project other than making money. And so they devised a special edition with a contract. Pope would get all of the profits from the subscriber edition. So he would start this whole thing by getting together people who would pony up the money. They would do a volume a year. So the money that came in, it would help, float the first volume, and then they would get, the subscriptions to help with the second volume, et cetera. They would do 4 books of the Iliad a year. Only his edition could have certain illustrations and certain features. The trade edition the publisher would use was not allowed to have them. And so we happen to have this special subscriber edition here in a complete run in our rare books room. I don't know why we have it. I don't know if you've ever figured out why we have it. I was here 20 years before I knew we had it, but it is something well worth looking at, because in the history of publishing and English poetry, it's actually a big deal. So here you see what part of how subscription works is to publish the names of the subscribers. In his original Iliad subscription list, it began with the princess. By the time he got around to doing the Odyssey, it begins with the king, that is George I, right? So one of the things that's nice about subscription publications like this is you can literally see the audience he's writing for. And these are some of the greatest people in England, some of the most powerful nobles, also members of the clergy. And a lot of times to really help him out, they would buy 6 volumes, but actually only take 1 volume, so that, he would have 5 extra volumes to do. And this is how, basically, the thing got off the ground. Now, other people had tried other things, and again, this is just another edition of Homer. As a young boy, Pope was very strongly affected by this 1660 edition by John Ogilby, who was a printmaker and a map maker, and you can see it's richly illustrated, right? Unfortunately, the poetry is terrible. But as an addition, it was spectacular, and as a 9-year-old, Pope was just mesmerized by the visual impact of this, right? And the way he actually got this off the ground, he was a great businessman, was, he would sell the right to a nobleman to use, to basically sponsor a whole page illustration, and he would put their coat of arms and their name there, and that would raise capital to help with this project, right? Ogilvy had problems sort of getting this off the ground. He also resorted to book lotteries and all kinds of crazy things, but this is something that was, an important precedent for Pope. But if you look at Pope's design, what you'll notice is he is very careful about the visual, right? The design is such that the visual produces an element at the very beginning, perhaps at the end, but most of the time what must dominate is the poetry. Why? Pope is a poet foremost, right? And you can see a struggle in him between whether the visual or the poetic should really, take off. So what you see is, universal throughout the edition. You have the argument, which is just talking about what happens in that book. You have a little copper plate headpiece, so it's a smaller type of illustration. It's not a full page, but it's pretty detailed illustration. And you'll notice then we have an initial. The initial itself is illustrated. We would call it historiated, right? That tells you in the visual of that image, inside the letter T there, something from the story. His Odyssey, again, does the same thing, but as I'll say it does it a little differently because now he's actually working with somebody, William Kent, who has his own ideas about how this should work. But he's doing a good job of trying to keep the visual in check. So he produces it on purpose in a very large font that he chose himself on paper, that he chose himself for the special edition. 20 lines per page, which is quite ample, lots of spacing so that you can fully get it, and it's in quarto format, which is actually rather small compared to the large folio of Ogilvy, right? And the idea is this would be something that you could sit out, on your patio at your manor house or whatever, and enjoy reading and seeing as poetry. Then there's a whole sort of page, title page, that blocks you off from critical observations, and this is a different way of approaching the text, but it's kept completely separate, which is a lot of critical reflection on Homer, on poetry, on the text, and this is a time when, especially in France, there had been enormous amounts of debate about antiquity and modernity and Homer, and whether Homer was a good poet or a bad poet. So one of the things you'll see here is he knows how fully to engage his audience. So you get 4 books of translated poetry, you get the observations on each book, and that makes 1 volume, and then he will go through 24 books then in a series, bam, and cash in at every turn. I'll just do this quickly. You can again see the little difference in illustration. Here's Ogilvy, right? You can see Athena trying to stop Achilles from killing Agamemnon there. In the version that you get in Pope's edition, this is quite accurate. Athena is yanking him by the hair. So again, the visual element is quite arresting. And then we get a lot of interplay. Here, for example, a picture from Ogilvy, a full folio page, is the priest, Chryses, who's come to sue for the release of his daughter, and Agamemnon's rejecting him. Well, what Pope does is to make that the illustration inside the T, you'll see. So he picks up a lot of these motifs. Here again, in the famous Book 6, the headpiece illustration is the most famous scene, which is Hector returning to talk to his wife Andromache, and there's his little son there. But inside the N, we see the matrons of Troy sacrificing to Athena, right? So again, the first letter is beginning to tell the story, right? But the headpiece illustration may tell you the most important. Here we have, in Book 22, he's dragging Hector's body, a very famous moment in the text, a sort of climax in a way. But again, the T that begins that book is Hector fighting with Achilles. Here you can also see, he kind of does an homage or maybe some plagiarism, again, with Ogilvy's illustration. And then lastly, we have here in the headpiece to Book 24, that's King Priam, who's come to beg for the body of Hector from Achilles, who's there. They seem to be serving a cheesecake or something. But inside the inn is the dream that Priam has that sets him off on this whole thing. Now, as I said, the interesting thing is this tension between the visual and the verbal seems to be working itself out when Pope has to turn and do the Odyssey, which he wasn't really thrilled to do. In fact, he hired some guys to help translate because he just wanted to get sort of through it. But one of the things you'll notice is William Kent has a very ornamental style and less illustrative and, in terms of full-body storytelling and more a little on the abstract side. For example, in Book 1, this is largely ornamental as a headpiece, right? But you'll see in the center, that is the bard Phemius, who's playing in Book 1. And of course, that stands for the whole of the song, right? So you'll notice there are elements of a feast that are there, but the feast itself that's going on, you're not seeing. Also, you'll notice the initial is purely ornamental now, right? In Odyssey 3, there's an important sacrifice going on. So again, what we see are implements of a sacrifice. At the center, you see the god Poseidon, and it says to King Poseidon, right? But you don't see the actual scene itself. This is kind of fun. So when Odysseus is with Calypso, right, in her grotto, he's, if you can see in the center little coin, look, the little round part, little tondo, it says Calypso, brilliant among goddesses, and there's Calypso next to Odysseus, who's building his raft, right? But the grotto looks very architectural, and this is really funny, okay? It doesn't look natural, right? It looks architectural. So what do you do when you get that Homer money? Those checks come in? You build yourself a grotto. So because of his Homer money, by now he's doing the Odyssey, so he already has all the money from the Iliad, he was able to lease a massive estate in Twickenham along the river, and he did a lot of odd things here. He built a little tunnel so he wouldn't have to walk across the road to go over to gardens he had, but he builds a grotto, right? And so that's obviously a kind of joke going on. You can actually visit Pope's Grotto today. The actual manor house is gone, but they've reopened the grotto. It's a very weird thing, but I guess that's the equivalent of a swimming pool in his day. Just a last little bit here. So the Book 9 is the story of the Cyclops, right? And, that's a powerful visual thing. And you see the Cyclops is at the center, and that line in Greek is, I will eat no man last of all, right? This is where he promises the favor he's doing Odysseus, he'll eat him last of all. But you'll notice the ram and the ewe are there, that little festoon there is actually what they're munching on, right? Now, the weird thing is, as much as at the beginning you see Kent trying to restrain the visual, in the tail pieces, these things go crazy. So here's Odysseus getting out of the cave. He looks like he's being assaulted in an alarming way by that, but he's supposedly tied under the ram, right? And here it's almost a joke. Odyssey 11, Odysseus is rushing out from the underworld lest he see the Gorgon, right? And so they do this illustration of the Gorgon, so you're actually seeing what you're not supposed to see. But each case, all of these illustrations only come at the end, as if to say that the poetry has to have it say first, and then the visual element can only come last, right? And they go a little crazy with some of the stuff in the tail pieces that are really quite inventive, including interfering with the poetry, as you can see. So the way they actually produced this, they printed the text first, and then they would go to a separate press, and they had copper plates that they would roll the already printed text through, and that's how you can get things like this here. Oops, sorry, Casey. And so I'll leave you with this image. Poetry and painting, as weird kissing Pootie. It's a very disturbing image, but this is what Kent did at the very end of the Odyssey as a way of sort of showing that these arts are coming together in the book. But I think if you look at this, as you certainly can, it's over there, you'll see there's like a whole argument going on about the visual and the poetic in this remarkable subscriber edition. Okay, thank you.